The first time they came, it was 7:15 on a cold, foggy morning, the kind of morning when the world feels muffled, the air thick with the smell of damp pine and wet earth. Helen Baxter had just poured her second cup of black coffee, the steam rising in soft, ghostly tendrils as she settled into the old rocking chair on her front porch. She had wrapped herself in a heavy wool cardigan, the one her late husband had given her for their 25th anniversary, and was leaning back to enjoy the quiet when the sound of crunching gravel shattered the morning calm. 3 black SUVs rolled up her driveway, their headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of hungry wolves. She set her coffee down slowly, her pulse quickening as she watched the vehicles come to a stop in the small clearing beside her cabin. Doors swung open, and 6 men climbed out, their boots hitting the gravel with sharp, deliberate thuds. They wore dark tactical gear, their chests emblazoned with the bold, white letters HOA security, and their faces obscured behind mirrored sunglasses and tight-lipped scowls. Helen's heart raced, but her expression remained calm, her fingers tightening around the edge of the armrest as the men approached her porch. The leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut and a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, stepped forward, his hands resting lightly on his belt as he looked up at her, his eyes hidden behind his reflective lenses. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "We're here to conduct a compliance inspection. We've had some complaints from your neighbors about unauthorized structures, noise disturbances, and possible code violations." Helen blinked, her mind racing as she processed his words. She lived on 10 acres of thick, densely wooded land, miles from the nearest neighbor. She hadn't had a noise complaint in years, and the only structures on her property were the small, hand-built cabin she and her husband had restored together and the rickety old dock down by the lake, which had been there since the 1950s. She had always kept to herself, paid her taxes, and minded her own business. This made no sense. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I wasn't aware that the HOA had jurisdiction out here. My property is outside the community boundary." The man's lips tightened, his jaw flexing as he shifted his weight, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. "That's not how we see it, ma'am. This land falls within the expanded jurisdiction of the Crystal Lake Homeowners Association, as defined in the revised bylaws. We're authorized to inspect any property within the designated boundary for compliance." Helen felt a flicker of anger spark in her chest, her fingers tightening on the armrest as she met the man's mirrored gaze. She had read the HOA's bylaws, had pored over them for hours when she first bought the cabin, and she knew for a fact that her land had never been part of the community. It was a loophole, a small, forgotten oversight in the original development plan that had allowed her to purchase the cabin without ever signing a single HOA agreement. "I don't recall signing any such agreement," she said, her voice growing colder as she rose slowly from her chair, her eyes never leaving the man's shadowed face. "And I don't appreciate uninvited guests showing up on my property without notice." The man hesitated, his fingers twitching at his sides as he exchanged a brief, tense glance with one of the other men, a shorter, stockier figure with a scar running down the side of his face. The leader cleared his throat, his jaw tightening as he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl. "Ma'am, I suggest you cooperate. It'll be easier for everyone if you just let us do our jobs." Helen felt her pulse quicken, the familiar, electric thrill of a fight building in her chest as she took a slow, deliberate step forward, her shadow stretching long across the mist-covered ground. She had spent decades as a civil engineer, building bridges and flood barriers, negotiating contracts with billion-dollar corporations, and holding her ground against men who thought they could bulldoze her with a few sharp words and an intimidating stare. She had faced far worse than this in her time, and she wasn't about to be bullied on her own front porch. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp and cold as the mountain air. "Do your inspection, but make it quick, and don't touch anything without my permission." The man hesitated, his fingers flexing at his sides as he glanced back at his men, then gave a sharp, curt nod. They spread out quickly, moving through the trees and around the side of the cabin like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. Helen watched them go, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with 1,000 half-formed thoughts and suspicions. As the men disappeared into the mist, she turned and walked back into the cabin, her pulse still racing as she reached for the old rotary phone on the kitchen wall. She dialed the number for the county clerk, her fingers trembling slightly as the line rang once, twice, 3 times before a thin, reedy voice crackled through the receiver. "County clerk's office, how can I help you?" Helen took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the cool, smooth plastic of the receiver as she forced herself to remain calm. "This is Helen Baxter, out at Crystal Lake. I need to verify some property boundaries. I think the HOA is trying to pull a fast one." There was a brief pause, a soft rustle of paper, and the faint clatter of a keyboard as the clerk pulled up her file. "All right, ma'am," he said finally, his voice growing more confident as he scanned the screen. "I've got your records here. Looks like your property is outside the HOA boundary. Always has been. They have no jurisdiction over you." Helen felt a slow, fierce grin spread across her face as the words sank in, the tight, hot coil of anger in her chest unwinding into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. "Thank you," she said, her voice low and steady as she hung up the phone and turned to stare out the window at the shadowy figures moving through the trees outside. "Thank you very much." She reached for the folder of documents she kept in the bottom drawer of her desk, the one labeled Property Rights and Easements, and pulled it out, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the familiar pages. They thought they could intimidate her, bully her into submission, but they had just made a critical mistake. They had underestimated her. And that, she knew, was the one mistake you never made twice. Helen spent the rest of that foggy morning pacing the creaking floorboards of her cabin, the cool, rough grain of the old pine beneath her feet a stark contrast to the heat building in her chest. She set the thick manila folder on the kitchen table, its edges already worn from years of careful study, and flipped it open with a sharp flick of her wrist. The papers inside were a mix of hand-drawn survey maps, faded typewritten deeds, and neatly typed letters on official letterhead, each one a piece of the puzzle that proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that her property lay well outside the Crystal Lake HOA's jurisdiction. She knew this land like she knew the lines on her own hands, had walked its boundaries countless times, measuring and remeasuring the distance from the edge of the lake to the old fire road that cut through the pines. She had chosen this spot precisely because it was unincorporated, a patch of wild, untamed land free from the petty tyrannies of suburban governance. As she thumbed through the stack of documents, her mind drifted back to the first time she had seen the cabin, decades ago, when she and her late husband had stumbled upon it during a weekend drive through the mountains. It had been a ruin back then, its roof sagging and its windows shattered, the old dock half sunken into the muddy bank of the lake. But Helen had seen its potential, had imagined the cozy, sun-drenched sanctuary it could become, and had convinced her husband to buy it on the spot, ignoring his protests about cost and logistics. They had spent the next 2 years restoring it, pulling up rotted floorboards, replacing broken windows, and rewiring the ancient electrical system by hand. It had been their labor of love, their retreat from the pressures of the city, a place where they could escape the endless meetings and late-night phone calls that had dominated their professional lives. She smiled faintly at the memory, her fingers tracing the bold, looping signature of the original owner on the first page of the deed. Carl Dawson, a grizzled old trapper with a thick white beard and a permanent scowl, who had insisted on selling the cabin to them for a song, provided they promised to leave the land as wild and untamed as they had found it. Helen had kept that promise, had resisted every urge to clear the underbrush or pave the winding gravel road that led to her front door. She had watched with quiet amusement as the developers inched closer each year, carving neat rows of identical houses into the once pristine hillsides, their manicured lawns and tidy driveways a stark contrast to the rugged, overgrown wilderness that surrounded her cabin. But now, it seemed, they had finally crossed the line, had pushed too far in their quest for control and conformity, and Helen had no intention of letting them get away with it. She set the folder aside and reached for the phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed Raymond's number. The line rang twice before the old lawyer picked up, his gravelly voice crackling through the receiver like the rustle of dry leaves in an autumn breeze. "Helen," he said, his tone tinged with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What's going on? I got your message." She took a deep breath, her heart still pounding in her chest as she recounted the morning's events. The sharp, angry words of the so-called HOA cops, the clink of their boots against the gravel, the way their reflective sunglasses had flashed in the misty morning light like the eyes of hungry predators. She told him about the boundary dispute, about the call to the county clerk, about the old manila folder now sitting on her kitchen table, its contents as damning as a smoking gun. Raymond listened in silence, his steady, measured breathing a small comfort in the chaotic swirl of Helen's thoughts. When she finished, there was a brief pause, a soft creak of leather as he leaned back in his chair, the faint clink of glass as he set his coffee mug down on his desk. "All right," he said finally, his voice growing sharper, more focused, as he shifted into the professional, no-nonsense tone that Helen remembered so well from their days in the trenches of municipal law. "First things first, you need to document everything. Every visit, every conversation, every piece of mail. Keep a log, take photos, and save every scrap of paper they send you. If this goes to court, you'll need a clear, comprehensive record of their harassment." Helen nodded, her fingers tightening around the phone as she leaned against the cool, polished edge of the kitchen counter. "Already on it," she said, her voice steady but tinged with a hint of the old fire that had carried her through decades of boardroom battles and budget negotiations. "Good," Raymond replied, his tone growing warmer, more reassuring. "Second, you need to push back, hard. Send them a cease and desist letter. Demand an immediate retraction of any claims they've made regarding your property, and remind them that you're prepared to pursue legal action if they continue to harass you. Use the strongest language you can without crossing the line into outright threats. Make them realize you're not just some scared old lady they can push around." Helen smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude for her old friend's support. "I can do that," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I can definitely do that." They talked for another 10 minutes, hashing out the finer points of her strategy, before Raymond finally hung up, his parting words ringing in Helen's ears like a battle cry. "Make them regret ever knocking on your door." Helen spent the rest of the day drafting her letter, carefully choosing each word, each phrase, each line of dense, unyielding legal jargon. She laid out the facts, cited the relevant statutes, and included copies of her deeds, surveys, and easement agreements, each one a quiet, devastating reminder of just how badly the HOA had miscalculated. When she finally finished, her hand aching from hours of writing, she folded the thick stack of papers into a crisp, white envelope, sealed it with a sharp, satisfying snap, and dropped it into the mailbox at the end of her driveway, her heart pounding with a fierce, quiet pride as she watched the red flag snap into place. As she turned to head back up the long, winding gravel path to her cabin, the wind whipped through the trees, rustling the dry, dead leaves that clung stubbornly to the branches overhead. Helen pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, her breath steaming in the cold air as she whispered a single, defiant word into the empty, snow-covered clearing. Checkmate. She knew the battle had only just begun, that the HOA would come back, angrier and more determined than ever, but she felt ready, stronger than she had in years. She had drawn a line in the sand, and she had no intention of backing down. Helen didn't have to wait long for the HOA's response. It arrived 4 days after she mailed her letter, a thick, cream-colored envelope with the HOA's embossed logo in the corner and the name of a high-priced law firm she vaguely recognized from a scandal involving a local developer a few years back. She smiled as she tore it open, her pulse quickening in anticipation, her mind already racing through possible counters as she unfolded the neatly typed pages and scanned the dense, carefully worded paragraphs. The letter was exactly what she had expected, a clumsy, hastily assembled attempt at intimidation, filled with vague threats and baseless accusations, each one more absurd than the last. It accused her of everything from building code violations to unauthorized land use, cited bylaws she had never agreed to, and demanded that she immediately cease all unapproved activities on her own property or face escalating fines, legal action, and possible eviction. Helen felt a slow, cold anger settle in her chest as she read the letter, her fingers tightening around the thin, crisp paper as the words blurred before her eyes. They thought they could scare her, that they could bully her into submission with a few strongly worded paragraphs and the looming specter of financial ruin. They had no idea who they were dealing with, no concept of the quiet, unyielding strength that had carried her through a lifetime of challenges far greater than this. She set the letter down carefully, smoothing its creased edges with the flat of her hand, and took a deep, steadying breath, forcing herself to remain calm, to think clearly, to channel her anger into something useful. She had spent decades solving problems, untangling complex regulatory snarls, and negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts with men who thought they could bulldoze her with a few sharp words and a hard stare. She had built bridges, held back floods, and carved tunnels through mountains. She could handle a few puffed-up bureaucrats in bad suits. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed Raymond's number, the old rotary clicking and whirring with each slow, deliberate turn of the dial. He picked up on the third ring, his voice crackling through the line like the low, steady rumble of distant thunder. She read him the letter, her voice calm but edged with steel, her free hand clenching and unclenching around the cool, polished edge of the kitchen counter as she paced the small, sunlit room. Raymond listened in silence, his breathing slow and steady, his lawyer's mind already picking apart the flimsy arguments and empty threats like a hawk stripping flesh from bone. When she finished, there was a brief pause, a soft creak of leather as he leaned back in his chair, the faint clink of glass as he set his coffee mug down on his desk. "They're bluffing," he said finally, his voice growing sharper, more focused, as he shifted into the professional, no-nonsense tone that Helen remembered so well from their years of fighting City Hall together. "They have no jurisdiction, no standing, and no case. They're trying to scare you into compliance, hoping you'll fold before you realize how weak their position is. But they don't know you like I do. They don't know you're a fighter." Helen smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude for her old friend's confidence, the tight, hot coil of anger in her chest unwinding into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. "So what's the play?" she asked, her voice low and steady, her mind already racing through possible counters, each one more satisfying than the last. Raymond chuckled, the sound low and dark, like the first rumble of a coming storm. "First, we respond. Firmly. We hit them with a cease and desist, demand an immediate retraction of their claims, and remind them, in no uncertain terms, that you're prepared to pursue legal action if they continue to harass you. Use the strongest language you can without crossing the line into outright threats. Make them realize you're not just some scared old lady they can push around." Helen nodded, her fingers tightening around the receiver as she leaned against the cool, polished edge of the kitchen counter. "Done," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "What else?" "Next," Raymond continued, his tone growing more intense, more urgent, as he outlined his strategy. "We hit them where it hurts. We file a formal complaint with the county zoning board, challenging their claim of jurisdiction over your property. We demand a full audit of their financial records, a comprehensive review of their bylaws, and a detailed accounting of every fine, fee, and assessment they've ever issued. We drag their dirty laundry into the light, make them squirm, make them bleed. They want to play hardball? Fine. We'll show them how it's really done." Helen felt a slow, fierce grin spread across her face as the words sank in, the familiar, electric thrill of a fight building in her chest like the slow, steady rumble of an approaching avalanche. She had always loved a good battle, had thrived on the adrenaline rush of high-stakes negotiations and last-minute deal-making, and she could already feel the old fire igniting in her veins, the sharp, exhilarating rush of purpose that had carried her through decades of conflict and challenge. "All right," she said, her voice growing sharper, more focused, as she reached for her pen and notepad, her mind already racing through the first draft of her response. "Let's do this." They spent the next hour hammering out the details, Raymond's deep, gravelly voice crackling through the line like the low, steady growl of a caged predator as he outlined their strategy, each word a carefully sharpened blade, each sentence a precise, surgical strike designed to cut the HOA's flimsy arguments to ribbons. They discussed the language of the letter, the tone, the pacing, the precise wording of each demand and threat, crafting a document that would strike fear into the hearts of even the most arrogant board members and send their high-priced lawyers scrambling for cover. When they finally hung up, Helen felt a deep, bone-deep satisfaction settle in her chest, a fierce, unshakable certainty that she had already won this fight, that she had outmaneuvered her enemies before they even realized the game had begun. She sat down at her desk, her fingers flying over the keys of her old typewriter as she poured her anger and frustration into the letter, each sharp, satisfying clack of the keys echoing through the cabin like the staccato crack of rifle fire. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding in her chest as she reread the neatly typed pages, each one a quiet, devastating reminder of just how badly the HOA had miscalculated. She folded the thick stack of papers into a crisp, white envelope, sealed it with a sharp, satisfying snap, and dropped it into the mailbox at the end of her driveway, her breath steaming in the cold mountain air as she whispered a single, defiant word into the empty, snow-covered clearing. Checkmate. As she turned to head back up the long, winding gravel path to her cabin, the wind whipped through the trees, rustling the dry, dead leaves that clung stubbornly to the branches overhead. Helen pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, her breath fogging in the cold air as she smiled, a slow, fierce grin spreading across her face as she imagined the look on the HOA president's face when they received her letter. They had underestimated her, had mistaken her quiet, unassuming demeanor for weakness, but they had just made a critical, fatal error. They had picked a fight with the wrong woman. And now, they were about to learn the hard way that even the quietest, most unassuming people can be the most dangerous when pushed too far. Helen's letter hit the HOA like a bomb. It was a masterpiece of precision and restraint, a carefully crafted blend of legal muscle and unspoken menace that left no room for misinterpretation. She had drawn her line in the sand, made her position clear, and now all she had to do was wait. But waiting had never been her strong suit. She had spent too many years fighting for every inch of ground, every scrap of respect in a world that often preferred its women silent and compliant. She wasn't about to start playing the passive victim now. 2 days after she mailed the letter, a white SUV with tinted windows pulled into her driveway, its engine purring like a well-fed predator as it coasted to a stop beside the old woodpile. Helen watched from the kitchen window as the driver's side door swung open and a man in a sharp, charcoal gray suit climbed out, his movements quick and efficient, like a soldier advancing on a target. He was tall and lean, his close-cropped hair silver at the temples, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. She recognized him immediately. Marcus Dillard, the HOA's high-priced attack dog, the lawyer they called in when the fines and threats didn't work, the man who had made a career out of steamrolling small businesses and elderly homeowners into compliance. Helen felt her pulse quicken, her fingers tightening around the edge of the countertop as she watched him straighten his jacket and adjust his tie, his eyes scanning the cabin and surrounding woods with the sharp, predatory gaze of a hawk sizing up its prey. He crossed the gravel driveway in long, purposeful strides, his polished leather shoes crunching against the frost-covered ground as he made his way to the front porch and rapped sharply on the door. Helen took a deep, steadying breath, forced her hands to relax, and crossed the small, sunlit kitchen, her boots clunking softly against the polished hardwood as she reached for the doorknob. She opened the door slowly, her face a carefully composed mask of polite indifference as she met his cold, calculating gaze. "Mrs. Baxter," he said, his voice smooth and controlled, his tone carefully calibrated to project both authority and vague, unspoken threat. "Marcus Dillard, representing the Crystal Lake Homeowners Association. I believe you received our letter." Helen smiled, her eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned casually against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her chest in a deliberately defensive posture. "I did," she replied, her voice calm but edged with steel. "And I sent you a response. I assume that's why you're here." Dillard's jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation flashing behind his carefully blank expression as he pulled a neatly folded copy of her letter from the inside pocket of his jacket and held it up between two perfectly manicured fingers, as though it were something mildly distasteful. "Yes, we received your correspondence," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm here to discuss it. to see if we can resolve this situation without further escalation. Helen felt a slow, fierce grin spread across her face, the tight, hot coil of anger in her chest unwinding into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. "By all means," she said, stepping back to allow him inside, her eyes never leaving his as he crossed the threshold and entered the small, sunlit cabin. She closed the door behind him, the soft click of the latch echoing through the quiet, empty room like the cocking of a loaded gun. Dillard hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking around the cabin's interior, his nose wrinkling slightly at the smell of pine and wood smoke that hung in the air like a ghost of winters past. He stepped into the center of the room, his polished leather shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor as he turned to face her, his expression carefully blank, his eyes cold and assessing. "Mrs. Baxter," he began, his voice low and measured, each word carefully chosen to project an air of calm, unassailable authority. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. The Crystal Lake Homeowners Association is simply trying to ensure the safety and security of all its residents. Our bylaws are designed to protect property values, promote community harmony, and maintain a high standard of living for everyone in the neighborhood. I'm sure you can appreciate that." Helen felt a flicker of amusement spark in her chest, her lips twitching into a small, tight smile as she leaned back against the edge of the kitchen table, her arms still crossed over her chest, her fingers tapping lightly against the soft wool of her cardigan. "Oh, I appreciate that, Mr. Dillard," she replied, her voice low and steady, her eyes never leaving his as she slowly, deliberately unfolded her arms and reached for the thick, battered manila folder that lay on the corner of the table. "I just don't see what any of that has to do with me. My property isn't part of your association, never has been, never will be. You have no jurisdiction here, no authority, no legal standing. You're trespassing, Mr. Dillard, and I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff." Dillard's jaw tightened, his carefully controlled expression slipping for just a moment as his eyes flicked to the folder in her hand, his nostrils flaring slightly as he caught a glimpse of the neatly typed pages inside. He hesitated, his fingers twitching at his sides as he struggled to regain his composure, his mind racing through the possible counters, the carefully rehearsed arguments and legal strategies he had used so effectively in the past. But Helen could see the doubt, the uncertainty flickering behind his carefully blank expression, the first small cracks in his confident facade, and she felt a fierce, bone-deep satisfaction settle in her chest as she realized just how badly he had underestimated her. "I'm trying to offer you a way out, Mrs. Baxter," he said finally, his voice growing sharper, more urgent, as he took a small, deliberate step toward her, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in, his breath warm and sharp against her cheek. "A chance to resolve this quietly, without dragging it through the courts, without wasting time and money on a fight you can't possibly win. But if you insist on pushing this, on making this a battle, I promise you, I will bury you. I will drown you in paperwork, bleed you dry with legal fees, and drag this out until you have nothing left but a pile of unpaid bills and a foreclosed cabin. Is that what you want?" Helen felt her pulse quicken, the tight, hot coil of anger in her chest unwinding into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. She leaned in, her face inches from his, her eyes locked on his as she whispered, her voice low and steady, each word a carefully honed blade. "I've spent my whole life fighting men like you, Mr. Dillard. Bullies, con men, liars. You have no idea what you're up against. So go ahead. Try to bury me. I dare you." Dillard's eyes widened slightly, his pupils contracting as he took a small, involuntary step back, his carefully constructed facade cracking like thin ice beneath a heavy boot. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, his jaw working soundlessly as Helen straightened, her eyes still locked on his, her breath slow and steady as she watched the fear and uncertainty flicker across his face. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her voice growing colder, sharper, more dangerous with each word. "Now get off my property, and don't come back unless you have a warrant." Dillard hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to the door, his fingers twitching at his sides as he struggled to regain his composure, then turned on his heel and strode out of the cabin, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor as he made his way back to his car. Helen watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest as she reached for the phone and dialed Raymond's number, her fingers trembling slightly as the line rang once, twice, 3 times before the old lawyer picked up, his gravelly voice crackling through the receiver like the low, steady rumble of distant thunder. "Raymond," she said, her voice low and steady, her eyes still locked on the retreating figure of Marcus Dillard as he climbed into his SUV and gunned the engine. "It's time to take the gloves off." Helen didn't waste a moment. The instant Marcus Dillard's SUV disappeared down the long, winding gravel drive, she set to work. She poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, rolled up the sleeves of her thick woolen sweater, and cleared the kitchen table of the scattered papers and manila folders that had accumulated over the past few days. She needed space, both physical and mental, to lay out her next move, to assemble the pieces of the puzzle she had been quietly collecting for weeks. She knew she had the advantage now, knew she had struck a nerve with Dillard, had shaken his carefully constructed facade of calm, professional detachment, and exposed the raw, naked fear beneath. But she also knew that fear alone would not be enough to bring the HOA to its knees. She needed leverage, real, tangible leverage, the kind of undeniable, irrefutable evidence that would force them to back down and retreat with their tails between their legs. She spent the next few hours combing through her files, pulling out every deed, every survey, every scrap of paper that documented her ownership of the cabin and surrounding land. She photocopied the original title, the easement agreements, the county zoning maps that clearly placed her property outside the HOA's jurisdiction, and the handwritten letter from the original owner, Carl Dawson, confirming that the land had never been incorporated into the Crystal Lake subdivision. She arranged the documents in a neat, methodical stack on the corner of the table, each one a small but essential piece of the legal fortress she was building around herself. Next, she turned her attention to the HOA itself. She pulled up the association's financial records, the ones she had downloaded from the county's public records database during one of her many late-night research sessions, and began to sift through the columns of numbers, her eyes flicking back and forth between the neatly printed rows as she searched for discrepancies, irregularities, signs of waste, and mismanagement. It didn't take long to find them. The HOA had been bleeding money for years, funneling funds into questionable projects and high-priced consultants while neglecting basic maintenance and community services. There were unexplained withdrawals, overinflated invoices, and entire line items with no apparent purpose other than to pad the pockets of the board members and their cronies. She made a list, carefully documenting each suspicious entry, each inexplicable expense, until the list stretched to 3 full pages, her neat, looping handwriting filling the narrow columns of her yellow legal pad like the slow, steady advance of an army closing in on its target. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair, her fingers stiff and aching from hours of furious scribbling, her mind buzzing with the familiar, exhilarating rush of a well-executed plan. She had them. She had the leverage she needed, the smoking gun that would force them to retreat, to abandon their ridiculous claims and leave her in peace. But she wasn't done yet. She had one final, devastating card to play, a trump card that would not just end the battle, but win the war. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed Raymond's number, the old rotary clicking and whirring with each slow, deliberate turn of the dial. He picked up on the second ring, his voice crackling through the line like the low, steady rumble of distant thunder. She explained her findings, her voice calm but edged with steel, her free hand clenching and unclenching around the cool, polished edge of the kitchen counter as she paced the small, sunlit room. Raymond listened in silence, his steady, measured breathing a small comfort in the chaotic swirl of Helen's thoughts. When she finished, there was a brief pause, a soft creak of leather as he leaned back in his chair, the faint clink of glass as he set his coffee mug down on his desk. "You've got them, Helen," he said finally, his voice tinged with a mixture of admiration and barely contained excitement. "You've got them dead to rights. They can't talk their way out of this, can't bluff or bluster or threaten their way past these numbers. They're finished." Helen felt a slow, fierce grin spread across her face, the tight, hot coil of anger in her chest unwinding into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. "Good," she said, her voice low and steady, her eyes narrowing slightly as she imagined the look on Dillard's face when he realized just how badly he had underestimated her. Then let's end this. They spent the next hour hammering out the details, Raymond's deep, gravelly voice crackling through the line like the low, steady growl of a caged predator as he outlined their final assault. Each word a carefully sharpened blade, each sentence a precise, surgical strike designed to cut the HOA's flimsy defenses to ribbons. They drafted a formal complaint, a scathing, meticulously detailed document that laid out the full extent of the HOA's malfeasance, their financial mismanagement, their fraudulent claims of jurisdiction, their repeated violations of state and federal law. They included copies of Helen's deeds, surveys, and easement agreements, as well as the damning financial records she had uncovered, each one a quiet, devastating reminder of just how badly the board had miscalculated. When they finished, Raymond promised to file the complaint first thing in the morning, to hit the HOA with the full force of the law before they had a chance to regroup and mount a defense. Helen hung up the phone, her heart pounding in her chest as she leaned back against the cool, polished edge of the kitchen counter, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as the full weight of what she had just done began to sink in. She had taken on the HOA, had struck back against their petty tyranny and bureaucratic overreach, and she had won. She had outmaneuvered them, outsmarted them, and now, at long last, she had them on the ropes. The next morning, the lawsuit hit the HOA like a sledgehammer, sending shockwaves through the small, insular community as homeowners scrambled to distance themselves from the sinking ship, as board members resigned in disgrace, as lawyers whispered frantically into their cell phones and accountants shredded incriminating documents in a desperate attempt to cover their tracks. The local news picked up the story, their cameras swarming the normally quiet streets of Crystal Lake as reporters grilled the remaining board members for comment, their microphones thrust into sweating, trembling faces as the once proud leaders of the HOA stumbled through hastily prepared statements and empty promises of reform. And through it all, Helen watched from her small, sunlit cabin, her heart swelling with a fierce, unshakable pride as the carefully constructed facade of the HOA collapsed around her, its foundations crumbling beneath the weight of her quiet, unyielding defiance. She had drawn her line in the sand, had stood her ground against the full force of the HOA's intimidation and bullying, and she had won. She had taken back her home, her freedom, her dignity, and in the process, she had reminded them all, the bullies, the bureaucrats, the would-be tyrants, that even the quietest, most unassuming people can be the most dangerous when pushed too far. As she sat on her front porch that evening, the sun dipping low behind the trees, the cool mountain air filling her lungs with the sweet, sharp scent of pine and wood smoke, Helen raised her coffee cup in a silent, defiant toast to the battle she had fought and won, a quiet, unassuming warrior in a cardigan and woolen socks, a force to be reckoned with in a world that had tried, and failed, to break her.